Hello, world history students. Today is the end of Unit 5, and maybe you can tell by the title of this particular lecture, Changes in Medieval Society, Black Plague, and Hundred Years' War, that it is quite a bit of stuff to get through, but hopefully it's enjoyable. Unit 5, Part 4. First of all, I need to tell you about some agricultural advancements that were going on as the Dark Ages ended and we started to move forward into a different period of time. One of the things that happened was a switch from the kinds of animals that were pulling plows. You can see oxen in the image there pulling a plow, and they switched over from oxen to horses. Horses are more nimble, they're faster, and the reason that they could do that is because they came up with better plows and harnesses. Harnesses are the thing that goes around the neck of an animal. Oxen didn't need anything special. They were really quite tough with very thick necks. Horses are a little bit different, and they came up with a new plow that fit around a horse's neck better, and that made the horse be able to pull the plow faster. And when they pulled the plow faster, then of course they could plow more land and eventually produce more agricultural produce. Another thing that they were doing is rotating. There was something called a three-field system. They're rotating the crops that they have in the fields so that there's a spring crop, and then a fall crop, and then 1/3 of the land is left completely unplanted so that it has a chance of regaining some nutrients, and then they rotate every year like that. All of these things led to more food being produced, which led to people being healthier, having enough to eat, being able to ward off sicknesses, and then people who were getting more than enough to eat also were having more kids, so growing population. Economically, things were going pretty well at this period of time too. There was the establishment of something called guilds. Guilds are groups of workers from the same industry who were organized in order to make sure that the quality of their products and the prices of their products were relatively high, and that their working conditions were really fairly decent as well. So you can imagine that a guild could be all of the people who make cloth in a town, all of the people who are butchers in a town, all of the people who make barrels in a town, all of the candle makers and so on. They're organized so that there isn't competition between them. It is anti-capitalist, but it seems to work out for the people back then. There are people also who were merchants and who were artisans and who were academics, who were all parts of these different guilds. Academics, of course, being like teachers or professors, and artisans are the craftsmen, and the merchants are the people who are selling things. At the same period of time, there's a commercial revolution going on with an expansion of trade and business. That means that more products are being traded in towns. They're being taken around. People are trading things between towns, and there's just a general increase in business going on at this period of time. Sometimes people wanted to buy up a number of things and take them to another place and then sell them for more money. Sometimes people wanted to open a shop, or they wanted to open a mine, and they needed money to do so. And people started to borrow money from banks. Banks started to be established around this period of time and provided money for the opening of all kinds of businesses and all kinds of trade. This advances economics as well. And then too, as a result of the Crusades, there was an increase in interaction and trade with foreign lands, mostly Europeans buying things from foreigners rather than foreigners buying things from Europeans. But nonetheless, in Europe at this period of time, they are buying a lot of things from Asia, for example, or from the Middle East via the Silk Roads. That increased population was leading to urbanization, or more people living in towns. Still, the number of people who are living in towns is very, very small. Probably like 5% of the total population were living there. But the towns are very, very important because they are the places where all of the trade is going on. They are the places where new kinds of social interaction is going on. In the countryside, you have a whole bunch of people who are just basically peasants who are just doing farming, and there are local nobles who are ruling over them. Inside of the towns, you have a whole different kind of world going on. Even though it's only 5% of the people, you have town councils, for example, running a town. And feudalism, that idea of a knight or an aristocrat getting a plot of land in order for that knight or that lord to be able to fight for a higher lord or a king. Whereas the peasants then just kind of hang around and support that person. That's being disrupted by these towns, as you don't have people in those towns who are growing food. You don't always have nobles. You have a whole different power structure in the guilds, and a whole lot more money being made. It's a monetary economy inside of the urban centers or towns. At this period of time, too, the Dark Ages are getting less dark with a revival of learning. There is interaction with Islamic societies due to the Crusades, and that gives the Europeans access to things that they had forgotten existed: Latin documents and Greek documents. That had been lost in the Dark Ages, and the Muslim people have copies of these things in Arabic that can be translated back into Latin, back into Greek, and Europeans can read them again and appreciate their own heritage. There's also a churchman by the name of Thomas Aquinas, who is made a saint by the Catholic Church. He uses this kind of old Greek science, this trying to figure things out using logic, but he doesn't try to do that to figure out how the world works. Thomas Aquinas is all about proving how religion is true, the existence of God is true, how the rules and regulations of the church are the kind of right things to do based on logic, not based on faith. It's really quite different than what most people do with religion. Usually religion is all about just believing without any proof. Thomas Aquinas is trying to bring some proof into religion. France developed around this period of time, or the French kingdom developed around this period of time. At one point in time, it was divided into dozens of small dynasties, or excuse me, not dynasties, but territories, after the Carolingian dynasty fell. That was the dynasty or the family of Charlemagne, if you remember that. And so all of these patchwork of states were pulled together by a guy by the name of U5P4. He started off in Paris, and he started to expand his territory to become what you and I know of more or less as France. So this happens over a period of time. You can see at the map there, the Capetian monarchy looks like most of France. Philip II is one of the more powerful rulers of this Capetian dynasty. He expanded France and centralized the power, weakening the feudalism or weakening the power of the nobles and creating a stronger kingdom and a stronger monarchy. England, too, was developing around this period of time, going all the way back to about the 400s. It was invaded by Germanic tribesmen, and then in the 800s or 900s, it was invaded by Vikings. It was a very violent and chaotic place. There was a Frenchman by the name of William the Conqueror who invaded England in 1066. He defeated the people who lived there, the Anglo-Saxons, and created a unified England. It was the descendants of William the Conqueror who set up the beginnings of what we know of as the Magna Carta, started to set up things like trial by jury, a kind of set of common laws by which people would be treated somewhat fairly, the idea of Parliament, which comes from the Magna Carta. Parliament comes from the idea of a bunch of nobles or barons parleying or talking to the king and giving him advice and telling him what he can do and can't do. And that all starts in around 1215 with the Magna Carta guaranteeing basic political rights. The barons or the nobles at that period of time basically told their king, King John, what they thought the right thing was, that he should be guaranteeing these basic political rights. And he really, one king standing against a bunch of nobles, really didn't have a chance to do anything. And so he agreed to that and signed on to this Magna Carta. Well, something really pretty terrible happens in the mid 14th century, or the 1300s. And what happened was a plague broke out called the Black Plague or the Black Death. Before that even happened, though, there was a famine. Some of the weather turned bad in the early 1300s. It turned much colder and much wetter. Things weren't growing quite as well, and the people of Europe were weakened by that for several years of bad harvests and bad growing conditions. And then this bubonic plague or Black Death, Black Plague, traveling along the Silk Roads from the southwestern part of China all the way to Europe in the late 1340s, it devastated the European population. It had a 60 to 70% mortality rate. That means if you caught it, you had 60 to 70% chance of dying. It's caused really by fleas that are on black rats. And these fleas jump off of the rats and onto humans and bite humans and then put this bacteria in people's bloodstream. That's the beginning of the Black Plague. Sometimes people would get this Black Plague. It would be in their bloodstream. They would cough a lot, and then it would become pneumonic plague, where the Black Plague could be caused by people breathing each other's air. About a third of Europeans died from about 1346 to the early 1350s. It was a very terrible time. As you can remember, 1 out of every 3 people dying in a short period of time. Just really wrecked Europe completely. Because of the Black Death, urban populations fell, especially in crowded cities. You had these fleas jumping off of the rats and getting onto people, and from people to people, and then people coughing and so on, wherever there were lots of people together. And so urban populations fell. Remember, urban populations are where the economy is really booming and where new things are happening. Trade declined as well, as lots of merchants died and artisans died, and people became fearful of going from place to place. Prices fell as well. There's not very many customers anymore to buy all of the things, and so individual barrels or individual um, articles of clothing and so on are no longer quite so much in demand. Peasants thought that they should be getting higher wages because there were fewer peasants and there was just as much work to do. And the people who owned the land, the lords or the nobles, refused to increase wages, and so peasants revolted. The Catholic Church really lost power because priests left their duties. They didn't want to stick around and deal with all of the dead people. They couldn't seem to deal with the plague at all. The Pope couldn't stop the plague, and so people really started to doubt the church or to doubt the clergy quite a bit. People were looking for all kinds of causes for the plague. We'll see that on Friday with the test. But one of the things that people decided, just because they were foolish at this point in time, is that Jewish people were causing the plague. Jews oftentimes got massacred before the knights went off to the Crusades, and now just a couple hundred years later, or actually during this period of time too, Jews were being blamed for the plague and were targeted violently throughout Europe. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed, and there were more than 350 separate massacres that took place. Really terrible time, but people are frightened, they're desperate, they're looking for somebody to blame, and sadly, oftentimes Jewish people in Europe get blamed for things. Finally, another tragic thing that happened was called the Hundred Years' War. The last Capetian king of France, Philip IV, died without an heir. And there was another Frenchman who had a claim to be the new French king, but England's king, Edward III, also thought that he might be able to claim the throne, and this started a war in 1337. So it's basically a conflict between the English king and a guy who wants to be French king, and they are fighting over who should be the French king. It's not really a 100-plus-year war. It's really just a whole bunch of years of short raids and skirmishes, and every once in a while a fairly significant battle. Early on, the English were winning a lot of the battles, and they were claiming a lot of French territory. But then a really kind of amazing thing happened. A peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc, um, was hearing holy voices. She was hearing saints. She thought she was hearing um, holy people telling her to help chase the English out of France. And this is what she does. She's basically a nobody, but she shows up and tells this guy who would be French king, this Frenchman, that God and the saints have been telling her that he should be the king of France and that she's going to rally the troops of France. And sure enough, the craziest thing happens. Men listen to her, and she leads them into battle and they start to win this Hundred Years' War against the English. Eventually, by about 1453, the English are driven out of France. Kind of a sad end to Joan's story. She was captured by more or less by the English, and the English thought that since God or the saints were telling her that they were the bad guys, that she must be under the influence of the devil, and they burned her to death for being a witch. Well, that Hundred Years' War meant the development of a bunch of new technology, like that thing that you see there, the longbow, as well as cannon. And you can also see on the left-hand side, there are guys using crossbows. These kinds of new technologies could take out a knight on the battlefield. And so it weakens feudalism as knights became less important for the military, and just regular guys who can use longbows or cannon or crossbows started to become important. English people and French people started to feel real nationalism or love for their own countries and hatred for the other country. And having an English king in France just seems like a bad idea, and people weren't willing to put up with that. And then once the wars ended, in France, the English went home, and then they had their own kind of problem with who the next English king should be, and they fought a little civil war called the War of the Roses. That, well, I guess it wasn't little; it lasted about 30 years themselves, but it's just among English people. So you're not always really sure who the next king's going to be, and sometimes wars get fought over it, I guess is the point. Well, that was a whole lot of information given to you fairly rapidly. I hope, though, I provided what you needed for the EQs. But if not, come visit me during my office hours and we can talk more. Go ahead and do that lecture check and have a nice day.